Welcome. What we're talking about today is designing for deeper learning. As Isha introduced me, I'm the Chief Learning Strategist here at Upside Learning. What I want to talk about today is I don't know how that happened. What I want to talk to you today is about why deeper e-learning, what we're talking about, and talk about what the implications for practice and reflection and engagement, and what we should be doing going forward. So I hope that makes sense. Let's get going. Before we do, I do want to tell you a little bit about my background to understand the strange and twisted way I look at the world. I saw the connection between computers and learning as an undergraduate. I designed my own major. My first job was designing programming educational computer games. I went back to get a PhD in applied cognitive science. And that's sort of been my career ever since, taking what we know about how we think, work, and learn and applying that to design of solutions. I was an academic for a while. I worked in a few startups. For the past couple decades, I've been a consultant to corporations and not-for-profits and government and education. And I'm an author and speaker, and now I'm working with Upside Learning. So the first question we really should address is, what is learning? Now, I'm not talking about formal learning yet. When I talk about real-world learning, I tend to think of it this way. Learning is action and reflection. We act in the world, and when we reflect on that, we learn. There is some learning that happens sort of subconsciously, but if we really want to accelerate it, and particularly for areas that are unfamiliar and unlikely to be developed naturally, we really helps to have reflection. So we act in the world, reflect on it. This, however, that's the natural mechanism we have for learning, which suggests that formal learning should be designed action and guided reflection. So we should create specific situations where people should act, and we should scaffold reflection around that. If we do that, we argue that's the best, most effective approach. So what are our goals for learning? If we're trying to create learning outcomes, is transfer to all appropriate situations and no inappropriate ones. So together, if it's there when we need it and we can transfer it to where we need it, we have had a useful impact of our learning. We really do want impact. We don't, by and large, learn for intellectual self-gratification. We learn to be able to do new things, and particularly for organizational learning, we learn to be able to do things that the organization needs us to be able to do. That said, what is deeper learning? Sure, we've done a lot of interventions trying to achieve learning, and by and large, a lot of what we do isn't effective. In fact, Beers and his colleagues looked at a meta-analysis and pointed to it, suggested that it said only 10% of investment in learning actually leads to impact. That means 90% isn't. That's not a good thing. So deeper e-learning is grounded in the cognitive and learning sciences. It's grounded in research on what actually works for learning, not our mythologies, not historically what we've done, not the myths we have about learning, but what actually has empirically demonstrated to lead to those goals: retention over time and transfer. By the way, I get excited about this. I talk fast. If you come up with any questions as I'm speaking, please feel free to toss them in the chat. I can stop. We have enough time. I can address them. So please feel free to challenge me at any point. One of the problems of being involved in this field for so long is that many times I skip over things that I think are obvious and aren't. So please feel free to ask questions as we go along. So one of the important questions is, what is the biggest miss in implementing learning? What are the things we don't do well enough? Because addressing that has the biggest likelihood for impact in achieving our organizational outcomes. And I want to suggest that the biggest miss is actually action. Remember I said action and reflection, and for formal learning, it's designed action and guided reflection. We do not do enough action in our formal learning by and large. It's a lot of information, like today's lecture, but there's a reason for that, because you're active in your daily life. This is a reflection opportunity. But when we're creating formal learning, we need to make sure that our learners are learning. A number of years ago, several folks got together. They had been around the field for a long time and were walking another expo hall and were bemoaning that another year had passed. We were seeing shiny new buzzwords and all sorts of fancy new tools, but nothing had fundamentally changed. And they wondered what they could do. And this was Michael Allen of Allen Interactions, Julie Dirksen, who wrote the fabulous book Designed for How People Learn, Will Thalheimer, one of our great translators of research practice, and one other guy, came up with what they stipulated was the difference between typical e-learning and what serious e-learning should be. And they characterized, content focused versus performance focused, and knowledge delivery versus authentic context. There were whole things. I encourage you to look at it after this session, but go look up the e-learning manifesto. But importantly, if you look at what differentiates a lot of these elements, it's meaningful, it's engagement driven, there's context, decisions, actions, feedback. This is about practice. Making better practice is a major focus of this. And it's specifically focusing on performance. It's not about learning, which is a funny thing to talk about in a deeper learning presentation, but we don't learn to be able to know new things. We learn to be able to do things. So when we start with learning objectives, we're actually, I want to suggest, on the wrong path. We should not be looking at learning objectives. Those are focused on what we should learn. We should be focusing on performance objectives. Objectives that say, what are we going to be able to do differently? And I realize there are lots of barriers to this. There are organizational barriers and cultural barriers and our industry barriers. But really, we should be going out and finding out, what do people need to be able to do differently? When we go beyond that, we look at what does that action really require. And I want to focus on 3 core elements of the Serious E-Learning Manifesto. And thank you, Isha, for posting the link into the chat. Authentic context, realistic decisions, and real-world consequences. These are the elements that make a difference. These are the elements that, if we get this right, we have a much higher likelihood of developing our learners into having those 2 critical capabilities: retention over time and transfer. So I want to suggest that story is important, and we tell stories. Our brains are wired to interpret stories, but we are talking about something different with practice here, with the action. We are having the learners create a story about their choices, but we set up the story. So we have a goal. What should the learner be trying to achieve? And there's some huge amount of background to this, and I'm giving you the Reader's Digest condensed version, and I'm using a metaphor that may not be relevant to all the audience. So I'm giving you a shortened, concise version of which there's a huge background behind, but we're creating a story. And the first thing is, learners need to have a goal. They need to know what they're trying to achieve, and they need to know what their role is. Who am I? What sort of actions can I take? What am I trying to achieve? And we set this in a story world. This is really important. It turns out learning in abstract situations, like we give kids in school, we give math problems with just numbers to manipulate, doesn't actually translate to ability to do very well. For our organizational learning, we really want to put people in situations that they recognize are worlds they can understand are relevant to what the goal is. We want to put them in a role. We want to give them a goal and give them mechanisms to try and achieve that goal. That's what it is. So our goal are the consequences. We want to achieve either positive or negative consequences. These are the ones that come out of the stories we get from our subject matter experts that tell us what to do and why. And then the role puts you in the place of making decisions to achieve positive or negative consequences. You, as the learner, are placed in a situation where you're given a role and a goal, and you have to make decisions and live with the consequences. You want to explore and see those consequences, because that's how you learn. That's the feedback. We'll give you didactic feedback as well, but first you should see how your decisions play out in the world. And the world is the context for your learning. The world is the setting in which this is happening that makes it meaningful, that makes your pursuit of this goal in this role in this world a part of a learning experience that is compelling, that is, learners go, oh, I can see that pursuing that goal is like the ones I have to do. And if I can successfully do that, that is developing my ability to perform. That's what we want. We're basically making it meaningful to learners. We should be choosing those goals and those contexts and those roles so learners are going, that is exactly what I can't do now and need to be able to do. They should recognize that this is something that they do need and don't know now. And then we need to have the appropriate level of challenge for where they are. Their difficulty they're facing in this particular story, this particular goal and role and world, should be appropriate for the level of skill. And here's the reason why, and this comes from both Csikszentmihalyi's flow and Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. If the challenge, the goal you're trying to achieve is too difficult for your current level of skill, it's just frustrating. More importantly, learning doesn't happen in that situation. Similarly, if the goal to achieve is too easy, it's boring. You're not really stretched. And in fact, I like to ask of audiences when I do this in live sessions, how many of you have ever seen a quiz question in a learning experience where the alternatives to the right answer were so silly or obvious, you could get it right without having learned anything? And I feel free to put your answer in the chat, but when I ask this question of audiences, everybody raises their hand. Everybody's seen these questions. And my response is, why? Why would we do this? What learning outcome happens from that? Basically none. Yes, you have seen that, right? Exactly. And it turns out that learning happens in between those two places. What Csikszentmihalyi, yeah, it is very silly indeed, Claire. Yeah, we see that all the time, and it's just maniacal. It doesn't do us any good. But when we pose questions, when we have practices where the goal and the decisions are in that difficult zone that's not too difficult but not too easy, that's where learning occurs. That's whether, and by the way, where engagement occurs. Csikszentmihalyi's flow talked about that's the optimal flow thing, but Vygotsky's zone of proximal development also suggested that that's where learning happens. And together, we better get them both. Prabhu asks, how do better engage the following millennial generation Y, generation Z for deep learning? Prabhu, I want to suggest something. I appreciate your question. However, the boundaries on those generational categories are not hard set, and using them actually is an overly simplistic way of categorizing people by what the year they're born instead of what they can do. And it's, to me, it's really important that we look at their individual ability and match the challenge to them. we engage those people the same way we engage everybody, giving them meaningful work. Malcolm Knowles wrote about andragogy, and he said, oh, adults need to learn in meaningful environments where the excess stuff is stripped away and they're focused on real problems. And then he compared that to pedagogy, which is what happens in schools and their didactic information dump and rote questions. And I don't like that discrimination, because it suggests that what we do to kids in school is okay, and it's not. They learn when it's meaningful and relevant and stripped away from unmotivated stuff. Our brains learn in the same way at different ages. We have more background knowledge as adults, and we have a slightly more working memory capacity, but the way we learn is still meaningful practice and reflection, and that's true at any age. And everybody cares if they're getting, the older learners may have gotten enculturated to trying to learn from bad information dump, but that actually isn't the most effective way. It isn't the most effective way. It doesn't work. And we really should be looking for making it a meaningful learning experience. Yes, absolutely. People, Gaurav, people don't know how to write good multiple choice questions. Our colleague Patty Shank wrote a wonderful book about it, but yes, we need to be caring. So those problems situated in that zone, the right level of challenge for the learner at this particular stage, with it being meaningful to them, they get that it's relevant. That relevant emphasis, and we'll get back to that later in the presentation, is so critical. So if I've been talking about the action part, right? The first element to me of reflection is feedback. The feedback should be specific to the choices you make. Our alternatives to the right answer should be misconceptions that people have. We have a little bit of randomness in our architecture, but most of our responses are patterned. You see repeatedly, people tend to make the wrong thing, and that's because they're bringing in wrong models. And you want to make those all, but each one is driven from a different reason, so you want to address them individually. If you're providing one single feedback for all wrong answers, you're not able to do that. The feedback should be specific to the choices you make and represent the misconceptions. Reflection is more than that, though. It's more than just the feedback. It's also models that guide our behavior. They can be presented beforehand in a sense, but they make much more sense once you are trying to take action. Now you suddenly understand why they're valuable. Let me be clear about what I mean by models, by the way. They are causal, conceptual relationships that explain how the world works. They're constrained. They only explain a small part of the world. But they do give you a conceptual basis to map to a context and do prediction. The real value of a model is it predicts what's going to happen. Because with a prediction, for your decisions, you can say, if I do this, this will happen. If I do that, that will happen. This is better than that, so I will do this. You don't get that if you don't have a model. We underestimate the value of models in learning, and yet they're really powerful. And we should be explicitly using them in our concept presentation as part of the content we provide, and our feedback should leverage it as well. And then examples. Examples show that concept from the model in context, in a particular situation, and it has a particular format that says, there's a narrative flow that says, I've got a problem, I will try this, this happened, it was or wasn't, I either succeeded or I failed, but also explicitly shows the thinking underneath, and it points to the model explicitly so that they're linked at the wrists and ankles, they're helping each other work together. So reflection is not just the specific feedback, but it's also the models and examples that you can refer to and give you feedback about your performance. They can come beforehand. We actually have good empirical evidence that for novices, at least, examples before the practice actually helps. But you need to make sure you have the good examples and graduated, and there's a lot more detail about the context and more that make this help. So those are important elements. It's part of what we're doing. At this point, I'm going to remind you of PEDX. Joseph, I don't know PEDX, but I will. There are lots of different models that have elements of this that converge together. That this is a synthesis, and it's only some of the top most important elements. There are lots of different models that have pieces and parts of this, so PEDX and other ones. Yeah, when you give an exercise, give an example first. That's a good idea, Joseph. We should be trying to create the opportunity for our learners to succeed, and by showing them the concept and showing how the concept plays in practice before giving them their own examples, particularly if they're novices, accelerates their performance. If they already have some expertise, it doesn't help as much. But when they're novices, it really matters. So we've talked about action reflection, but learning also happens with emotional engagement. Oh, okay, he's giving me PEDX: purpose, exemption, directions, examples, questions, start. There are lots of models with different elements. I find some of them emphasize important things, other things throw in things idiosyncratically. Not saying that that's a bad model. It just depends on where its origin and the elements it emphasizes. A lot of models are good. Some of them lead us astray. Things like learning styles turn out not to have empirical evidence, and yet a lot of people believe in it. So there is, as I emphasized up front, this is based on what the cognitive and learning sciences, what empirical research tells us. And I have no problem with PEDX on the basis of what you've said. I just want to make sure that if I dug into it, it was good. But it certainly has, directions, examples, questions. Okay, but beyond the specifics of cognitive aspects, we also know that emotion matters. It turns out in cognitive science, we talk about conation. We talk about the cognitive, the affective, and the conative, the conation. The cognitive is what we typically address with instructional design. Affective is who we are. That tends to be personality. A lot of the instruments aren't valid, but it seems to be relatively mutable, unaffected by our ability to try and change it. And I like the Big Five or Ocean or Hexaco as truly psychometrically valid attempts to try and find this out. So a lot of the proprietary instruments have major problems. So but conation is our intention to learn. So we have our cognitive and we have who we are, but our intention to learn, we can be strongly committed to learn this, or we can be really resistant. And so conation is that element, but we find that using that term, nobody knows it basically, and it gets confused with cognition. So we don't use conation. I talk about emotion. Let me be very clear. When I talk about emotion, I'm using a shorthand. I'm talking about motivation and anxiety and confidence, and these aren't technically emotions. And yet it's an easy term to use to talk about the difference from cognitive to the emotional side. So I use it as a shorthand, but let's dig a little bit deeper into it. So in many ways, we're talking about engagement. I recently wrote a book on how to make experiences engaging, but I didn't use the word engagement in the title. I called it Make It Meaningful. And the reason I did is because, as a colleague pointed out to me, the word engagement has accumulated a lot of baggage. So we tend to go, oh, click to see more, that's more engaging. It's not really. Oh, if everything's video, it'll be more engaging. Actually, that's not the case. There are a number of different things that have been lumped into engagement that aren't there. Gamification, let's add points and leaderboards. There are real problems with that. There are times when it makes sense, but just throwing it willy-nilly at problems isn't a good idea. And tapping into the intrinsic emotion is better. And so when I talk about engagement driven, I really mean digging into why people should care. So when I talk about emotion, I like to use this way to think about it. And this is not empirical. This is purely theoretical, hypothetical. But when we go through the learning experience, through our motivating example and objective and concept and examples and practices, and finally the closing, we don't think about the emotional trajectory, but we could and should think about motivation. After that first introduction, with your example, motivating example and objectives, people should be fired up. They should go, oh, I do need this. But do we think about that explicitly? And then we should maintain that motivation. We shouldn't allow it to die out after they go through the introduction. The first thing they see is a bunch of boring content, bullet points, person narrating in a monotone. You'll kill motivation. How do we keep it? How do we keep it up throughout the experience? At the end, it's okay if it disappears because now they have developed the ability to actually do it. We also should control anxiety. Learning is an anxious process in many instances. Sometimes you're eager, but many times if it's not aversive, it's worrying because I have to perform in front of others, or I have to perform where I can be evaluated and somebody's keeping track. And what if I screw up? That'll make me look bad. This is anxiety. We actually perform a little bit better. There's this thing called the Yerkes-Dodson law that says a little bit of stress leads to better performance and better learning, but it tapers off really quickly. And it turns out that's really sensitive. With certain learners, they're overconfident. You really have to slap them upside the head and shoulders, but most learners can be anxious. And so do we explicitly think about that at all? We should make sure that, we can expect it. We get their motivation hook, but we also kick in their anxiety. How do we keep that under control so it doesn't interfere with learning? We should, and yet we don't. And we should be gradually building confidence. We should not just assume it. We should be providing the feedback and letting people see their progress so that they can see that they are developing abilities. At the end of the experience, they don't need motivation more because they have that confidence. But we need to make sure we haven't introduced so much anxiety that interferes with their confidence. And all we need is enough confidence that at the end of the learning experience, they're willing to take a chance when they're faced with it in the real world. But we need to make sure we do that. So how do we do it? I want to first talk about motivation. And initially, we need an initial hook, an emotional hook that gets people going. And to me, that happens in the introduction or even beforehand in an invitation to learn. But if you haven't done that beforehand, when they come in, they should immediately be presented with something that gives them an emotional hook to say, oh, I do need this. I believe that actually has to happen before we do the cognitive side. Cognitively, we know we need to activate relevant knowledge because the subsequent learning will stick better if we've activated things they already know. But even before then, I suggest we have to hook emotionally, and that's by addressing the WIFM, what's in it for me. We should help learners see this, and I think I'm surprised how little we do this, say why you should care. And yet you should help people understand why this is relevant to them. And I often think you can do that with the consequences. We talked about consequences earlier, but showing them the consequences of having the knowledge or not having the knowledge. In fact, in an introduction, I think you can do this positively or negatively, dramatically or humorously. I tend to err on the side of humorously emphasizing the negative consequences, but depending on the audience, that may change. But you really want to help them go, I do need this, and I don't know it. You also need to say, and this experience will change that, but you build that up by knowing how to make that happen. But the hook is only the first part. Then you need to land them, to use a fishing metaphor. You need challenge, the right level of challenge. So they're going, oh, I think I can do this, but I'm not sure. If it's too easy, I can do this. Boring. Remember back to our diagram? Too difficult, it's frustrating. We need the right level of challenge. Plus, we need a story about what their role is in each individual instance of practice throughout the experience. We need practice after practice that are compelling with the right level of challenge and story. And we need psychological safety. It has to be okay for them to make mistakes and fail. We learners learning requires making mistakes. In many instances, that old story of error-free learning turns out not to be optimal, and in many cases challenging. Having them learn is okay. So we should be aiming to make sure that we're getting the learning out there, and making it safe. So, and there are a number of things you can do as a live instructor. You can be, self-deprecating and make mistakes yourself or admit to past mistakes. Humor helps. Even in asynchronous learning, though, giving people a chance to practice before it counts, all these things, we have a number of techniques, but we need to make it safe so people are truly willing to invest, to take the chances that will lead to learning. So, before, and really we're coming into the closing section of the talk. So right now I want to stop before I summarize and ask you folks, do you have any questions? Well, let me ask, is this making sense to you? And do you have any questions, any things I can respond to? There have been some things put in the chat earlier. I just want to open it up for that opportunity, and then we will go to a broader open, but I just want to make sure we're addressing any clarification at least or anything. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that, Matharam. Hope I pronounced that correctly. It's making sense. Okay, thank you. Excellent. Thank you very much for participating. Yeah, clear. Okay. Well, then with that positive feedback, I will move on to the summary then. Deeper learning requires, if we're going to do deeper learning, and when I say deeper learning, I mean learning that actually is going to have an impact. We do a lot of things that make people feel good afterwards. They say, I like the experience, but we're not tracking whether it's having an impact. If we follow this, we have a much higher likelihood of it having an impact, even if we don't evaluate it. Meaningful practice and feedback. Practice that is actually having people do the things they need to do, tied to the performance objectives, not learning objectives, performance objectives, and feedback on that performance that's specific to what they did. We should have alternate choices of decisions. They should not be easy to discriminate between. They should be appropriate for the level of the learner's ability to discriminate. And we should have specific feedback based on the alternatives if they get it wrong. And we should reinforce it if they get it right. It shouldn't be just right or wrong. It should be, you were right because, or you were wrong because, and the right answer is. We want to make sure we're getting that. Other than that, we want minimal appropriate resources. It turns out all that nice to know stuff actually interferes with learning. We have a limited ability to process. We need to control very carefully. The reason learning happens in that zone between boring and too difficult is because we've made it appropriate for the cognitive resources the learner has right now. We only need the minimal models and minimal examples to help us achieve it. We should be creating situations to practice and the minimal resources to succeed to get them to the end state. All the extra stuff doesn't help, it hurts. And we need engagement. We need to make sure that people are emotionally involved in the success of the learning experience as well as cognitively. Why? Because it actually leads to better learning outcomes. We have evidence on this. Arcana says 90% of my target audience is dispersed blue-collar colleagues. Engagement in non-operational learning is proving to be a challenge. Yes, if it's non-operational, they're going, why do I need to care? It's not relative to operations. Definitely be helpful to relook with our programs and trim the frills. Yes, and it's challenging, absolutely, kind of, because your experts go, oh, all this stuff is really interesting, really needing, and sometimes you want to make it interesting, and it doesn't help, it hurts. You need to, and it turns out there's actually research on this from the University of Southern California's Cognitive Technology Group, that experts don't have access to what they actually do. They have access to what they know, but not what they have to do. And so they can give you all the information about what they know, but you have to actually work harder to find out what they do and how to help the learners acquire that. But they will happily recite all this really interesting knowledge, and you really need to focus and work with them and go, what does that help them do differently? And that's your, what are the decisions they have to make that they can't make now? Because I'll argue that knowledge isn't, by and large, isn't going to make a difference to what's going to help your organization succeed. It's going to be the ability to make better decisions in a variety of circumstances. And Isha says, we have written a white paper about deeper e-learning that's available. So these are the elements I want to suggest. If we get this right, we have a much higher likelihood of achieving actual improvement in performance in the organization than if we're doing a bunch of knowledge dump and knowledge test that won't. Our goal is performance impact. We don't want to just make people happy. We don't want to just dump a bunch of information. Don't want to do. We should be wanting to make a difference in what people can do. And if we're doing that, we have to pay attention to deeper learning, especially with commission-based workers. Motivation to spend time is definitely less. Yes, if they're but if you're focusing on performance objectives, things that they can do better, and so often they focus on the top performance, and really the question is what's going to make a better difference to your organization. Moving your low performers to medium performers oftentimes is the biggest thing, and giving them focus on the specific things they need to do better, the performance that they need to be able to do, absolutely is going to be more motivating to them. It's going to have a bigger impact on the organization, and it's going to give you a better contribution to the success that you're charged with achieving. Okay. As Isha said, there's a white paper you can find out more on. But in the meantime, I'm happy to, yes, the 14 essential tips pulled out of that deeper learning white paper. It's sort of an infographic slide presentation, but I open it up to questions as Arcana was talking about her specific situation, the difficulties there. I'm happy to listen to more or send you on your way. And thank you very much for your attention to this point, and I wish you all the best. Please get in touch with us if you'd like to pursue any of this further, but we're now open for questions. This approach with all levels of learning look to ask. A lot of training we create is at awareness or comprehension level. Should we still include practice? I want to question, what does awareness or comprehension actually do for the organization? Being aware of things typically doesn't lead to performance change. And you're welcome, bro. So why are you doing awareness and comprehension? I don't know your audiences and I don't know your learning objectives, but I'm really curious what that sort of stuff does that helps the organization. Or is it actually just making people feel good that something's happening, but it's not really having an impact? And to be fair, in organizations, too often we don't check to see if we're having an impact. If we build it, it is good. But I want to challenge that and suggest that we should be, I would be inclined to ask in your organization, are you, what is this awareness trying to achieve? What does it do if they're aware of it? Do they? Yep. Yeah, Isha is mentioning that. So please feel free to fill in some more details or to help me understand that. Look, I sympathize. Many organizations will give, suggest to their learning and development, we need a course on X, we need a course on Y, and they really don't have a clear idea of what the problem is that they're trying to address and why this course is going to work on it. And good little learning and development departments will do what they're asked, but eventually I think you want to push back and say, what does awareness actually do? Just because they're aware of it, does that mean they're going to take it up? Or do they actually need to take action? If we want them to take action, maybe we need more. Joseph asked, how do we measure deeper learning? Good. I think that's an important issue for us to address. Deeper learning, if you remember my start, it was performance objectives. We should be looking to create, having people able to do things they can't do now. Then we need to see if they're doing it. It should be tied to a metric in the organization. It should be said that we are not, if it's sales, we are not closing fast enough, or our hit rate on closure isn't enough. And we believe that's because of X. So we're going to try a learning intervention to improve X. And then you measure it by those measures in the organization. Have our sales times decreased, or have our hit rate on sales increased? If it's operations, have we reduced errors? If it's marketing, have we, increased our whatever we're shooting for in marketing? Ideally, it's business metrics, Joseph. A secondary thing is, we looking for a specific change. And even if we don't look at that metric, we say, first of all, can they do it at the end of the learning experience? Not just did they like it, but can they actually demonstrate an ability to do whatever it is that our objectives specify? And then we should look afterwards and say, is that leading to a persistent change in the workplace? You can ask supervisors, are they observing it now? And by the way, most learning doesn't succeed if you haven't also prepped the supervisors to be a partner in the success. Because if they go back, many times supervisors can just extinguish whatever you've tried to do. Oh, that's not how we do it here. We're not paying any attention to that. No feedback. So you want to make, so looking, their ability to do it afterwards, it's level 2 on Kirkpatrick. Level 3 is saying, are they actually doing it in the workplace afterwards? That's level 3. And level 4 says, is it actually leading to a change in the organization? There's a much bigger conversation about that, Joseph, but that's the short answer, if that helps.